Once upon a time, there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down, to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. "Your talent should not be wasted," he heard in his mind's ear, and while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang, prompting him out of his stupor, and he went downstairs to see who it was. Alas, no one was visible through the window. No matter, it was probably a delivery person dropping off a parcel, and the ringing of the bell was merely to signal its arrival to any dwellers within, because, oh my, their schedule is so tight and their masters are so tyrannical that it would be impossible for them to stay any longer than was strictly necessary. Gerald tutted to himself, channeling a wave of sympathy to the unseen delivery person, and went to open the door. Alas, it would not budge. Strange, Gerald thought. Usually the door opens when I want it to. Perhaps I did not unlock it earlier. Gerald knew where the keys were. They were upstairs, back in his room, on the bedside table, glittering in the low orange wash of the energy bulb lamp. Up the stairs he went, reflecting, in muted despair, how he might fashion some grand work out of the disparate snippets of fairly decent writing he had left in the annals of his computer over the years. He reached his room, opened the door, and retrieved the keys. All of this was very easy because, as I've just said, he knew where they were. He swirled around on his heel, a rare moment of joy to experience the zephyr-smooth glide between sock and carpet, and returned to the door. Keys clinking, he pinched the one which would release the front door, and inserted it into the lock. Retrieval of the parcel was nigh. Alas, the lock did not yield. Gerald looked down and groaned. "Idiot," he cried in his head. "It's not that one." Perhaps Gerald would need to label each individual key, for this was not an unfamiliar occurrence. This time he had in his hand the correct key, and tried the lock once more. But again, the lock did not yield, and the door remained shut. Gerald's brow furrowed. Did he get the wrong key again? No, it was definitely the correct one. This was most mysterious. Why could he not open the door? Were the keys warped? Perhaps, as Gerald had not engaged in any exercise for some time, he had become too weak to open a door. His pride flared, and he tried once more with greater vigour to open the door. But still it would not budge. The parcel became a ghost of a memory in the swell of panic Gerald started to feel in his chest. Would he be trapped inside the house forevermore? No, of course not, he thought. I'll simply go to the back door and walk around. Perhaps I'll learn more from the outside. And, he quipped, I could get the parcel then too. He turned around to walk down the corridor to the back door, but as he did so, a strange sight was before him. It was another Gerald. Our Gerald's heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his chest. The other Gerald was identical to what Gerald thought he looked like, if the mirror from the bathroom this morning was to be believed. The other Gerald seemed almost as surprised as our Gerald felt, and stood stock still, with another set of keys in his hand. Could it be that this other Gerald had the correct set? How could that be possible when there was only one set of keys, and they always stayed in Gerald's room? Besides, it was unlikely that this other Gerald had got it from our Gerald's room, as there is only one way to his room, and that was via the staircase our Gerald took. This was all a little alarming. It felt like a long time being in that corridor with both Geralds unable to move with surprise. Our Gerald decided to venture. "Hello?" he might have said, but the word caught in his throat. Suddenly the other Gerald was upon him, keys brandished like a fistful of knives. Gerald squealed and flailed, but somehow managed, either through luck or an ancestral memory of martial artistry, to fling off the rampant Gerald enough to nearly stand and scramble to the back door. This door, luckily, was open, and Gerald was outside, and the door was slammed shut. Oh dear, Gerald thought, what on earth is happening? Why am I in the house? Another horrible thought struck our intrepid hero. If his keys didn't work, had he just shut himself out of his home? And another, was this other Gerald his replacement? And why would poor Gerald be replaced? This became very alarming indeed. Gerald remembered the parcel whose arrival invited this strange course of events. He would go around to the front of the house and collect it. hopefully before the new Gerald could unlock the door with his set of keys and take it for himself. Gerald swerved right past the overgrown pond, leapt over the low lattice fence that discouraged his dogs from leaving the garden when they went out into the garden to conduct their doggy business, and shirked himself towards the front door. The parcel, a neat cubic cardboard box roughly taped together, was before him. The other Gerald had not yet got to it. Gerald dared to try to peer through the window, but because he had put up a lightly meshed curtain on the inside last week to prevent people from doing such things, he had thwarted himself. He knew, however, that if Gerald was still in the corridor, he would see him very clearly. He yoinked the box and momentarily found himself unsure where to go. Would he return to the garden? Would he leave by the front gate into the street nearby? It appears going into the street was his decision. Gerald found himself in the street, shoeless, his socks now annoyingly damp and cold from the terrible rain we've been having, cradling the delivery which had set off this curious chain of events. He decided to open the parcel. It was challenging, as the tape that roughly sealed it shut was difficult to penetrate, but Gerald was overdue with chewing his fingernails, and with some insistent sawing, he was able to break the tape's hold, open the flaps, and see what was inside. He had a knife in his hand. It could have been a kitchen knife. It was certainly very weighty. Gerald hadn't ordered a kitchen knife or a knife of any kind. This was most vexing. The delivery person had clearly made a mistake, and now Gerald would have to rebox it, fill in a return form, and have to drive to the post office to have it taken back, probably at his own expense. He suddenly remembered he wouldn't have to drive to a post office, as there was one not 3 minutes' walk away, but that did little to dispel the tide of inconvenience he felt swirling in his gut. Of course, before he could undertake this task, he would need to go back into the house, and it was unclear what the other Gerald was doing, or, indeed, where he was. Also, where were Gerald's dogs? Surely they would have barked at a stranger inside the house, but perhaps they wouldn't have done, as they would have thought the new Gerald was Gerald. Was Gerald estranged from himself? It was a terrible and literal thought. Gerald also worried about having a murderous Gerald in the house. It was dreadfully surprising the way the other Gerald attacked him. It was necessary for Gerald to return to the house. Knife in hand, he had a decision to make. Would he go through the front door or the back door? Well, the back door was the only option because the keys didn't seem to work, so off he went. He crept back inside, angry at the metal mesh curtain that deterred wasps and other buzzy creatures from entering the house for making so much noise. Everything, aside from the tingling of the curtain settling, was entirely quiet. He went into the corridor, a little annoyed that the carpet would probably be soaking up the moisture he'd acquired in his socks, but could see no one there. Where could the other Gerald have gone? He gripped the knife a little tighter and went towards the stairs. Just on the wall beside the stairs he had, some months ago, erected a large mirror. He would not spook himself by being surprised at seeing himself in a mirror, because that was logical and normal. A reflection should not be another him. To legitimize his anxiety, which is something he read in a self-help book, the name of which escaped him, he would deliberately look in the mirror and see that nothing was wrong. Aside from the weird sight of him holding a large and probably not a kitchen knife, he looked how he expected himself to look, even if his hair had not been styled quite right this morning. He didn't like seeing another him on the top of the stairs in that mirror, however. Gerald felt a horrible rising rush in his body as he flicked himself around to see upstairs for himself. He caught a glimpse of the end of something moving just out of sight towards his room. This was one of those moments, Gerald thought, that would be entirely pivotal to what would happen with the rest of his life. He could leave his own home and seek some sort of help from passers-by, but who would believe that he had fled because of himself? No doubt a kindly soul would consider what he said in a metaphorical sense, nod sagely, and say the idea of running from yourself is a very familiar feeling, and it's taken them a while to realize that they are, after all, who they are, and so it would be better to embrace yourself in an act of benevolent acceptance. Everything will be all right, they will say. This is where great personal growth begins. Your whole life is now ahead of you, and any further entreaties to please understand what I'm trying to tell you would be met with irritation because their advice is sacrosanct. They know what they're talking about, they've been through it all before, and this resistance is proof that you've still got a lot of work to do on yourself. And it isn't my job to heal every soul that says the same thing. It always happens to me. I just attract these sort of people, and frankly I'm fed up with it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go home and feed the cat. And then, poor Gerald, he would feel both destitute and helpless and also annoyed at being made to feel guilty about a situation no one is primed for nor willing to understand. No, it would be far more convenient for everyone if he went upstairs and confronted other Gerald. With a level of surprising certainty, Gerald went upstairs, striding up 2 steps at a time, and curved around the corner towards his room. He paused, took a breath, and stepped inside. The other Gerald was there, standing upright and face-on at Gerald. His arms hung by his sides and his palms were open. He looked at him blankly, intently. Gerald gripped the kitchen knife. He thought he ought to say something. Perhaps he could be reasoned with. After all, he thought he was a very considerate person. He would listen with compassion and without judgment to most people, so perhaps he would do the same to himself, this other him. But this pause was all too brief, for the next moment Gerald lunged at the other Gerald and brought the knife down hard into his neck. It must have hurt a lot, or indeed the shock must have been so great at taking such a decisive action, because suddenly it felt like everything seized up, and the world went black. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang, prompting him out of his stupor, and he went downstairs to see who it was. Alas, no one was visible through the window. No matter, it was probably a delivery person dropping off a parcel, and the ringing of the bell was merely to signal its arrival to any dwellers within, because, oh my, their schedule is so tight and their masters are so tyrannical that it would be impossible for them to stay any longer than was strictly necessary. Gerald tutted to himself, channeled a wave of sympathy to the unseen delivery person, and went to open the door. Before he would grip the knob, however, he paused. He was suddenly assailed by an indistinct feeling of déjà vu. Gerald found this feeling very frustrating. He had had it many times before, just merrily going on with his life, well, not always merrily, he hastened to point out, but the point still stood, and for no discernible reason at all, this almost mythical suggestion that this was all very familiar would faintly blossom, and after a moment of trying to figure out precisely why and whether there was any reason for it, a warning, perhaps, it would dissipate, and no satisfaction would be gained. This time, much like every other time beforehand, would end exactly as expected. How irritating, Gerald would lament. Still, the door craved to be answered, and the parcel to be retrieved, so he went to open the door. Alas, it would not budge. Strange, Gerald thought. Usually the door opens when I want it to. Perhaps I did not unlock it earlier. Gerald knew where the keys were. They were upstairs, back in his room on the bedside table, glittering in the low orange wash of the energy bulb lamp. Despite knowing exactly where the keys were, he uttered a nonchalant sigh and went down the corridor towards the kitchen. Perhaps there was a thrill of anticipation to be gained by denying himself the pleasure of obtaining the package that must deliciously be awaiting him just outside the door that petulantly blocked his way. Well, if it was going to be petulant, then it would be ignored until it learned that it would never get its way with such childish tactics. The keys that awaited upstairs could be retrieved later. Besides, it was a quiet neighbourhood, and Gerald had ordered deliveries in the past, sometimes when he was not at home for hours, perhaps even a couple of days, and those parcels had happily greeted him, untouched when he returned. Plus, it was not currently raining, so there was nothing urgent about it. However, he did wonder at that moment if he had ordered anything recently. No, he wasn't expecting anything. Therefore, he should definitely go upstairs and collect those keys to the front door and see what awaited him. Perhaps Gerald was frightened, as he did not deign to move. It is no secret that Gerald suffers from some level of social anxiety. Indeed, when the doorbell first rang, or indeed any time it rang, he would be stabbed by a jolt of adrenaline before prompting himself to take action. He also got it when the phone rang. There was a chance that someone was waiting for him to receive the parcel, albeit out of sight at first glance. He knew that delivery people often had to take a photo of the delivered parcel, usually with an open door or, mortifyingly, of Gerald holding the parcel in the open doorway, predictably dishevelled, and he often wondered who would see or indeed publish such acts against decency. It is entirely possible it was a newbie who momentarily forgot and would have to double back. What if, Gerald wondered, without that photograph, the parcel would be taken away? And what if he had to retrieve it from a delivery centre, the thought of which would absorb his entire day, arming himself to contend not only with the inconvenience, but with people? All this would be of greater strain knowing that he, as far as he could remember, was not expecting a parcel at all, so such a trip would be fruitless as well as traumatic. It was a situation not to be entertained. He would go and fetch those keys. In an act of bravery, up the stairs he went. He reached his room, opened the door, and retrieved the keys. All of this was very easy because, as I have said, he knew where they were. He swirled around on his heel, a rare moment of joy to experience the zephyr-smooth glide between sock and carpet, and returned to the door. Keys clinking, he pinched the one which would release the front door, and inserted it into the lock. Retrieval of the parcel was nigh. The door opened. It opened. Which, of course, it would, because Gerald had the keys to the door and knew which keys opened which doors. This was entirely unsurprising and, in fact, perfectly normal. Before Gerald was a parcel, a neat cubic cardboard box, roughly taped together. He bent down to pick it up. He could find no name or address stamped on it. How mysterious. He looked around to see who would have dropped it off, but because he took too long to think about opening the door, no one was to be found. Perhaps it was not his after all, he thought, but why would it be dropped at his door? For now, it would be best to take it inside. Gerald steps back into the house and shuts the door behind him, parcel in hand. However, along down the corridor, in the space between rooms, a shadow lurks. No, not a shadow. A him. Another Gerald. How is this possible? Gerald's body seizes up. He can't... But he steps forward, trying to get a closer look at the shadowy other him. Why doesn't he move? Why does he just stare? Gerald doesn't have to wait for these questions to be answered. Suddenly, the other Gerald lunges at him. Our Gerald is slightly too far, and this other spectre slams his hands into the parcel, dislodging it from our Gerald's grasp, and stumbles nearly wholly onto the floor. Surprised and alarmed, but seeing his chance, Gerald leaps over the other him and runs to the back door, slamming it behind him. What was going on? Gerald's mind reels as he peers through the windows of the back door, trying to catch a glimpse of the impossible, but inside is too dark to make out anything clearly. Here he was, just a simple, boring man, not long ago trying desperately to carve something out of latent talent, and now he was faced with himself? Perhaps he was hallucinating. Such a thing is utterly impossible. And yet, he was familiar with the idea of doppelgangers, and how, perhaps, they might sow terrible discord, and people, unarmed with the weird truth of it, would immediately associate awful deeds with Gerald himself. He would be infamous. Assuming this one did awful deeds, of course. Was there an instance of benevolent doppelgangers? Are twins doppelgangers? He wasn't a twin, as far as he was aware, but the nagging thought of having to explain himself constantly, which was slightly and intolerably more than usual, filled him with such resolve that he would find a way to expel this impostor immediately. Or soon. Decisively, he opened the back door once more and stepped inside. Gerald was trying to think of everything he would say to this other Gerald, to reveal who he was, to discard his disguise, to leave, and why he would even bother him anyway, but nothing coherent could be strung together. Besides, the corridor was empty, and the remains of the parcel, ripped open, lay spread on the floor by the front door. It was terribly inelegant, and not even properly folded up for recycling, so this was proof that this menace was an imposter, and not really our Gerald. Where had he gone? Could he have gone upstairs? The way it lunged at him was so frightening. Perhaps there was something he could use to defend himself. Gerald crept up the stairs, ready in case the creature would appear, but found nothing at the top. He went into his room. But why did he go there? Surely he knew that there wasn't anything immediately useful there to expel the fiend. Thinking better, he turned around to find something else in the house. But he saw the other Gerald standing in the walkway. Something glinted in his hand. Was that a knife? Gerald's eyes widened. His mind raced with such momentum all thoughts evaded his grasp. Pitiful instinct took the reins. He stepped back and implored some understanding. Surely he would not think of... And suddenly the other Gerald leapt high, the terrible point of the blade plummeting down. How heavy that blade felt in the side of his neck. For one brief moment, he gasped, blinked. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear, and while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang, prompting him out of his stupor, and he went downstairs to see who it was. At least that's what any normal person would do, but Gerald, apparently, could be hard of hearing, especially when he was so focused on the quiet derision the voices within his head would often inflict. He sat at his desk, staring into space, perhaps trying to squeeze out some idea that would inspire him to act. There were days when Gerald would find himself unable to answer the door. The sheer effort of having to potentially interact with another human being, with their thoughts, judgments, and sorted-out lives, viewing this poor, dishevelled rat of a human with a look of dismissive pity. Or, worse yet, they were one of those chatty people that would suddenly proffer a deluge of what was going on in their lives. Gerald, bemused, ambushed, trying to kickstart his brain to receive such friendly words, trying to work his mouth to respond in a way that was cogent, empathetic, and sprightly, often thwarted as he tripped over his words through lack of use, was a frequent and devastating occurrence. Indeed, Gerald's mind would start dredging up acute moments of embarrassment, forever tattooed in brain matter, such as that time he was talking to someone at the coffee shop he used to work at, and for some inexplicable reason responded to a friendly remark about the weather in a terrible blanket northern accent, entirely involuntarily, and our poor Gerald cringed and despaired at this thought once more. It is a wonder how a doorbell can trigger such delicious self-flagellation. However, while we do enjoy delving into the mind of poor Gerald, his lack of action is terribly disheartening, so he got up to answer the door after all. But still his body did not move. Perhaps Gerald was experiencing a moment of catatonia. As far as we know, it did not run in the family, or indeed if such a thing was hereditary. That was likely another bramble-prick thought for Gerald to settle into. Or some whim of fate may, as it is wont to do, have simply beheld our quaint little protagonist and said to itself, "Oh yes, what good fun this will be. Why don't we strike him with a squidge of paralysis? Oh no, I really shouldn't. No, that would be so cruel. Him being alone in his room, trying to do something nice for himself, and, oh dear, another stab of misfortune to trowel upon the mound of his life. So uneventful, so wasted. Oh, I couldn't do that to him. Oh no. But you know what? Treat yourself. I'm going to do it anyway. And poop, there with a swing of the magic wand, hardened muscles, stiffened bones, terror in the mind as it tries to grasp the awful, horrible realization that Gerald needed help but could not summon it. Indeed, perhaps the person at the door could help, but how would he know? Besides, he would have a great schedule to fulfill by his capitalist overlords, so there would be no time to assist a little man in need. Suddenly, the fire alarm went off. Now would be the chance, Gerald, to cast off the shackles of this self-imposed catatonia and investigate. Gerald always harboured, against his veritable library of neuroses, a paranoid fixation that he had left the oven on. Perhaps this time he would celebrate his over-vigilance and relabel it as clairvoyance, pure unbridled justification at last. But I hasten to add, such an opportunity will only be available to him if he gets up out of that chair and quenches that fire. It is unwise to ignore a fire alarm, Gerald. We as a society, Gerald reflects, in an indulgent moment of stoic wisdom, that we are in fact trained to ignore fire alarms, because whenever they go off, it's always a test to make sure they work. They signal not danger, but interruption. But there could be a fire, Gerald. The devastation would be terrible. Besides, the noise is so insistent that you wouldn't be able to focus on your writing anyway. Are you ignoring me, Gerald? Gerald was clearly in the throes of a particularly severe case of writer's block. Despite having an inciting incident to begin the story, Gerald instead, radically perhaps, chooses to ignore it. What would occur if the protagonist simply does not rise up and embark upon the hero's journey? Logically, there would be no adventure, and he would no longer be a hero. Indeed, he would no longer be the subject of the story. And yet, bizarrely, oh, Gerald, you are rather clever. You have still made this story all about you. But what is it you're trying to achieve? Gerald decides to stay here forever. Gerald considers barring the door and window in his room. He wouldn't have to be bothered by anyone ever again. The fire alarm would stop because there was no fire. Eventually the doorbell's battery would run out, and then there would be silence. Food and water might thwart the idea of longevity, and having to make use of a discreet corner to urinate, and, I apologise, Gerald, defecate would be so unhygienic. And of course it would be, because as Gerald blocked access both inside and out, he wouldn't have access to anything with which he could clean. He would wallow in his own filth until such time as forever expired. Still unmoved, I see. Fine, Gerald, allow me to speak more directly. A little deus ex machina to resolve this little tantrum. Dull, I know, but my patience is running low, so to save any unpleasantness, I offer a solution. Play out this story to its logical end. Go and answer the door. Triumph against yourself. Not only will you achieve something, you will have a nice little story to say that you did a little bit of writing. Wouldn't that be nice? Yes, I know you probably technically did that the first time around, but don't you think stabbing someone was a little out of character for you, Gerald? And really, honestly, this is such a shit little story conjured out of some unimaginative stream of consciousness that you could definitely do with a bit of spicing up, no? I can offer that to you, Gerald. And won't you be pleased when it all gets resolved? Brought to a climactic finish? Now get up and go and answer the door. Very good. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, a while ago, prompting Gerald out of his stupor, and he went downstairs to see who it was. Alas, no one was visible through the window. No matter, it was probably a delivery person dropping off a parcel. You know what? There isn't any urgency about this one anymore. Gerald suffers a stroke and falls down dead on the floor. Darkness. Once upon a time, there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. With an unexpected rush of activity, Gerald pushed himself away from his desk, scrambled out of the chair, and peered outside the window. Being something of a homebody, Gerald rarely exposed himself to the sunlight, so it is entirely possible that his body, urgently craving some vitamin D and no longer satisfied with the cold white light of the screen, which he knew begged for further text to dim it out, explained the haste with which he conducted himself. The window proffered a view of the front garden. A tree, leafless, which Gerald had not yet cared to identify, stood to the left on a small, admittedly verdant lawn, and all around a wall of foliage which shunned the eyes and noses of busybody neighbours. On the right, out of sight, would be the gate where someone could press through these repellent bushes and, via a slightly curved stone path which led immediately below the window at which Gerald stood, access the front door of the house. Alas, however, this room slightly overhanged the front door, so it was impossible to see any potential visitors to his home, even by pressing his forehead to the glass. Gerald opened the window and pushed his head out as far as he was currently comfortable to do, but to no avail. The vista had not been improved at all. The only chance he would have to see anyone, he was reminded, would be the precious few seconds it would take for a person to proceed between gate and pathway. Gerald would need some degree of clairvoyance, or indeed luck, to anticipate by sight the arrival of any visitors, and Gerald certainly wasn't expecting anyone today. Nevertheless, Gerald convinced himself that he could hear the footsteps of someone's approach just out of sight, just beyond the gate from the street outside. He pushed himself off the windowsill and, with surprising alacrity, rushed out of his room, through the corridor and downstairs to the front door. He peered out of the door window. What he saw was an enormous shock to poor Gerald. His foresight was rewarded. Someone was indeed approaching his home. But it was him, another Gerald, holding some sort of cubic box roughly taped shut. How was this possible? He only had mere seconds to race through the thoughts anyone could possibly have to seeing themselves, outside of the circumstances of a mirror, because this other Gerald was there, outside, and the doorbell had rung. His eyes had steered towards the window quite naturally and spotted our Gerald. But Gerald, quite fearless, with murderous certainty, gripped the doorknob. He would confront this spectre. But as he turned it, the door would not open. And of course it wouldn't, because Gerald had locked it. Gerald knew where the keys were. They were upstairs, back in his room, on the bedside table, glittering in the low orange wash of the energy bulb lamp. He spun around and jettisoned himself upstairs. Clearly unused to such haste, just as he reached the top, he slipped on the edge of the step, and his body careered forwards, his knee thudding down hard on the beige carpet, a non-committal colour. Seemingly undeterred, Gerald lifted himself up and limp-ran the rest of the way into his room. He would get the key. He would confront this other him. He was so brave. But he was there, in his room. The other Gerald, upright, shadowy, gazing piercingly into our Gerald's soul. In one agonizingly slow instant, our Gerald's brow creases and his mouth starts to open. Something to say, to scream perhaps. But before any sound came out, the other Gerald, like a terrible demon moving too fast, rushes him. All goes black. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Gerald heaves a sigh and crosses his arms tightly. It seems today was more than usually a frustrating day. He sighs again and looks around the room searchingly. There were several cobwebs in the corners of the ceiling, but Gerald shakes his head. He points accusingly to the ceiling. Perhaps Gerald was going mad. One of his pet peeves was uncleanliness. but he was notably lackadaisical about it when it was his own filth in his own room. It seems he might have snapped, identifying minute dark spots he had noticed on the ceiling, although that seems surprising as the ceiling was just far enough away to be at the reach of his short-sightedness. If he wanted greater clarity, he would need to collect his glasses. Gerald shakes his head vigorously and stabs his finger towards the ceiling several times. Something must have been the matter. Oh dear, now don't roll your eyes, Gerald. There's no need for you to say anything. It is perfectly clear. The outcome of that last encounter with your friend was not completely out of the reach of possibility. Isn't he you? You only limit yourself. The mind, you see, capable of such vast greatness, but how easily it can be shackled with beliefs and ideas. It hungers for them, creates them, nurtures them so easily, so voraciously, that critical thinking sometimes evaporates altogether. It craves comfort, ease, certainty. Patterns are so intoxicating, aren't they? Why bother trying anything else when there is such a delicious shortcut to be accessed? It's not possible. I can't do it. What if I fail? What hope is there? Expand your thinking, Gerald. Open your mental window and allow all the cobwebs to fly. Fly away with the fresh ventilation of possibility. Gerald looks at the window. The physical window in his room, of course. That naughty window. Could he... He goes over to it and examines it closely. This window was no longer just a window. It was a possibility. See, even now you resist. Who's going to notice? You've barred yourself into this house with a wall of trees and bramble, and even if someone did, who would care? You know what people are like. They see something strange, but only the really weird souls get involved. Sensible people pretend not to see. They trot on by. You've done it yourself. The homeless people asking for some pennies on the streets. Those pesky salespeople in town with their lanyards and clipboards yearning to sign people up to something, and they always seem to notice you. Didn't start pretending to talk to someone on the phone in time. Oh dear, there they are suddenly, engaging with you, feeble excuses pouring from your mouth as you try to resume your stride, the vitriol they spew at you as you flee. The sort of friend, but really just an acquaintance that you notice coming towards you in the shop, but you simply must avoid. Oh, how thoroughly absorbing that shelf is now. Goodness, what a selection of tuna. Plenty of other people do that too, you know. So go on. Give it a try. You may never have mastered rope climbing with how little arm strength you have, but you've been pretty goat-footed on hikes, haven't you? Lean into it. Gerald unlatches the window and opens it as widely as it will go. He leans out and peers down. It's not a far drop. If he could simply let himself down gently, he wouldn't necessarily break anything. It might be a shock to the feet. Perhaps he could find a way to leap gracefully onto the loamy grass and cushion himself as he fell. Gerald did wonder if he might even fit through the window. Though slender of build, he was once again reminded that he hadn't embarked on any worthwhile exercise for nearly 4 months now. His belly was almost certainly starting to pooch a little, but he couldn't tell with any accuracy how many inches he could pinch when slouching on the sofa, and whether it was significantly more than usual. Probably not, but the sensation was definitely different, he thought. Nonetheless, he squeezed himself out, like Play-Doh through a syringe, gripping tightly to the edge of the panes as he surveyed the possibilities. There weren't any vines to grip onto, like there are in video games, but the lattice that was affixed to the outer wall might help. Of course, it is unlikely to hold Gerald's weight, but unlikely is not definitely. Perhaps Gerald would jump after all. No, without grace, Gerald decided to work his way around to face the wall and let himself down as gently as he could, before he discovers exactly why he should maintain a rigorous exercise regimen. His crampy hands weren't able to hold his weight for any longer than a meagre second, and he slipped down onto the stone path. A spring of gripping pain seized his soles, and, with the momentum of the fall, landed solidly on his arse. Excellent work, Gerald. It was a shame that the ground was still damp from the rain, so not only was his jogging bottoms now intimately discomforting, but he had left a perfect impression of his backside on the stone slabs. What would Gerald do next? He scrambles into a bush and crouches down as low as he can. Goodness, now his joggers and his socks are not only damp, but muddy as well. That's an unnecessarily prompt bit of washing and changing he would need to do shortly. But what had inspired Gerald to leap out of the window? It was peculiar behaviour indeed, and certainly wouldn't progress the thing he was trying to write. Gerald was looking intently at his front door across the way. Here proved a better vantage point compared to inside his room. Here he could see the pathway and the gate into the street, and also the way around into the garden which would lead to the back door. Perhaps Gerald was intrigued by the life of a squirrel, or a stoat, or perhaps a rather cumbersome bird. Life experience could inspire wondrous ideas. Gerald appears to be getting more and more agitated. Could it be he was expecting someone? But who would come to his house? He didn't have any friends. Well, he had friends, but they were so far away that they only visited when he and them mutually had time. But Gerald always had time, so it was mostly a one-way arrangement. Still, there had been no explicit plans for anyone to visit, so that couldn't be it. A delivery, maybe? But why would he hide in this bush? Surely common and accepted practice would be to greet this delivery person from the front door, opened from inside the house, take the item they had so graciously brought, and both participants be on their merry way. Perhaps Gerald planned to channel some mischief and suddenly pounce on whomever comes in a wicked but vaguely amusing prank, which would be fine in itself, but Gerald wasn't expecting a delivery today at all. Gerald could be in this bush all day. This behaviour, we must deduce, is abnormal and begs explanation. What exactly was he doing? Perhaps this was a test of some sort, of endurance perhaps. While not precisely the highest level of discomfort Gerald could inflict upon himself, this might qualify as an introductory exercise into some sort of endurance activity. The question remains, however, why? I don't know why you're glaring at me, Gerald. This was wholly your idea. Gerald reflects on his time in the bush. He has waited in it for a considerable amount of time already. He spends a lot of his time waiting. Perhaps he thought a change of context in which to wait would pierce the dirge of his life, with its plodding pace, hoping, waiting, fruitlessly expecting, as if the world owed him anything, for some happening that would ignite it, fill it with colour, life, zest, and stories to tell. But still, no one came, nothing happened, and still Gerald waited. This is dreadfully boring, Gerald. You have got to live life. Make things happen. If you forever stay in the bush, then the only person you spite is yourself. And those poor socks. You might have to bin them. Let me spell it out. No one is coming. You don't have to believe me. You can stay here if you wish. I can be patient. Okay, I relent. This is insufferable. Do something! Anything, Gerald! Nothing has ever happened in a bush. If you don't do something, I will end this, and we will try again. And don't test me, because you know I will. Must I treat you like a child? All right, Geraldy Worldy, my little schnookums, precious bebe. You have until the count of 3 to get up and do something, or some terrible, wearable, horrid little thing will happen to you. 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and Gerald suddenly launches himself out of the fruitless bush, tired of waiting. Indeed, what a strange endeavour to await the arrival of someone you don't expect. Or perhaps somehow in his bones he knew someone would appear. Perhaps that explains the stubborn way in which he refused to remove himself from the bush. He approached the front door, turned the knob, and found it just as intemperate. It would not open. And of course it wouldn't, because it was locked. And Gerald had left the keys up in his room. Making his way around the house into the garden and towards the back door, which he knew was unlocked, as early this morning he had taken his keys, unlocked it, let the dogs out, and in sleepy negligence fraught with the chill of the waking world did not relock it, with what we can only describe as a petulant swag familiar to a naughty child having been told off. He huffed with irritation as he flagellated himself mentally with, no doubt, how stupid he was, how ridiculous his behaviour was, and how helpless he felt on this strange day. Gerald stepped through the threshold and pulled the back door closed. Just as the latch clicked into place, he was surprised by the sound of a doorbell. Of course. If only he had waited just a few seconds more, he would have seen, or perhaps caught, the visitor who he must have expected. How frustrating for poor Gerald. With a deep breath, he made his way into the corridor and, his eyes widening in surprise, he saw what appeared to be himself, trying to open the front door, twisting the knob with ever-insistent force before it dawned on him that it was locked. The other Gerald turned and spotted him. 2 precious moments of suspended thought. Then Gerald's heart lurched into action and he hurled himself at this curious impostor. A useless tackle, a scramble, limbs flailing, and both of them find themselves in a roving, crumpled mess on the floor. But the doppelganger gets a fraction of an upper hand and uses a breadth of momentum to pivot our Gerald off of him and face down on the floor before him. The taste of carpet in his mouth, Gerald isn't quick enough to correct himself and resume whatever he was aiming to do to the impostor, but sees him stumble off down the corridor and, by the sound of it, out of the back door. A flash of thought crosses Gerald's eyes. Of course, the visitor he craved, the doorbell's insistent chirp from before. There was no sign of him now, but could it have been? Yes. Peering out of the window of the door, he could see, like an oblation before an altar, a cubic box, hastily taped shut. It was an unexpected delivery for him. He reached for the knob. Alas, our Gerald's memory is short, which he with sadness regularly re-remembered, lamenting his encroaching middle-aged years, for he discovered, again, as the doppelganger had barely a minute before, that the door was locked. Gerald knew where the keys were. They were upstairs, back in his room, on the bedside table, glittering in the low orange wash of the energy bulb lamp. With incredible haste, which suggested that he knew that whatever was in the parcel would be instrumental in rectifying this strange and worrying incidence of duplicity, he flew upstairs to his room. He would get those keys instantly. Around the corner he sped, spotted the keys, which winked at him with a sunlit sparkle, and snatched them up. He swirled around on his heel, a rare moment of joy to experience the zephyr-smooth glide between sock and carpet, and made to return to the door. Keys clinking, he pinched the one which would release the front door. At the top of the stairs, ice seized his body. Down there, the doppelganger was looking at the mirror, which indiscriminately betrayed his location. Gerald heaved himself back, but was certain that this familiar intruder had seen him. And indeed he must have done, for the thud-thud-thud of someone ascending the stairs made his adrenaline surge, and the only place he could go was back into his room. He was there, frenetic, frustrating panic, and suddenly the other Gerald was there in the doorway, with a horrible, glinting knife in his hand. A moment of stillness as the same eyes met each other. The window, Gerald. Realization dawns, but it is too late. Horror, and perhaps an expression that suggests, "Oh, for fuck's sake," springs across Gerald's face as the other Gerald is mid-air, the knife urgently, gleefully descending. A thump, and instant darkness. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat... Oh, Gerald was up and out of his chair. How awfully rude to interrupt, sir. He suddenly grabs the keys from his bedside table. He lunges for the window, opens wide and, dear me, starts to climb out, clinging to the panes, and drops. Gerald, could you slow down a bit? How am I meant to weave a gripping tale if you're rushing around so... Oh, you've unlocked the front door, have you? From the outside? Normally it would be sensible if, say, one was already inside the house, one would simply have to go down the stairs on the inside of the house and open said door from inside the house. This ludicrous attempt at parkour was, "Oh, you've rung the doorbell. Well, that is silly, don't you think? You're hardly going to answer that yourself, aren't you? Oh, maybe he is. Goodness, Gerald, I've never seen you run around the house with such speed. What a mighty gazelle you are. Gerald the Gazelle. GG. Oh, I see. This is a fun little game, isn't it? Like that time you ran along the road trying to get those watch your speed lights to activate and display how many miles per hour you achieved. How quickly could you answer your own doorbell? What fun. Watch how you bang that back door, Gerald. It's not impregnable. He's in the corridor. Why have you stopped, Gerald? You were about to set your PB, the parameter by which you could assess your subsequent attempts. Perhaps you're giving yourself a fighting chance for your next attempt. A lovely little dopamine hit of success. A cheap way of doing it, I must say, Gerald. You must always try your best, not sabotage a perfectly good run while you're doing it. Dear me. Gerald wends his way to the bottom of the stairs and looks in the mirror. He's dishevelled, puffing, panting, a little red in the face, the promise of a glow of sweat on his forehead, but he seems unusually uninterested in his appearance. He gazes at the top of the stairs, searchingly. What for is unclear, for nothing is there. Time passes, and the day melts away. Having given himself a tour of the house during which he inspected every nook and cranny he could find, Gerald now busies himself on the sofa, flicking through the channels on the TV. He's been unsettled all day and cannot seem to find anything to watch. For the 37th time in the last hour, he glances at his watch. It is rather late, and he hasn't managed to accomplish anything of note today. This was unremarkable. Every day of late had been much the same. Perhaps Gerald would inject some genuine pleasure into his life at some point. Something to say when a friend asks, "How has your day been?" Or the devastating, "What have you been up to?" Nothing much indeed. Gerald gets up off of the sofa and decides to head for bed. The evening had long since drawn in and everything was quiet and still. At least sleep brings a punctuation mark to the life he leads. It is also perhaps advantageous that it is a filling up of time. No one judges you when you're asleep. Gerald's mind was usually quiet in these precious hours in which he enjoyed dreamless sleep. Most of the time, anyway. Will he brush his teeth tonight? No, it appears not. He discards the clothes of the day, crawls under the covers, and clicks the comforting light off. Good night, Gerald. Sleep tight. Once upon a time, there was a man named Gerald. He sat... Okay. Once again, you deny me the proper introduction, Gerald. This is most vexing. How are we meant to craft... Fine, I will keep up the best I can. In fact, I'll give you a sporting chance. A head start. Carry on. Gerald had leapt out of his desk chair. With unusual urgency and exceptional hand-eye coordination, he had grabbed his set of keys from his bedside table and defenestrated himself. Now outside, and with a slight limp, he picks out a key and unlocks the front door. The moment he heard the latch give way, away he sprinted, grimacing as he tried his best to ignore that limp, and slammed through the back door. Into the kitchen he sped, and out of a jar of various utensils plucks the biggest knife he can find. Spicy. Casting it on the counter, he rummages through cupboards and drawers, big and small, making a terrible mess he would certainly have to clean up later. Oh, how that will haunt him until it's done, and retrieves, without any triumph, a cardboard box and a round of tape. We can slow down here a second, I think, as Gerald is certainly not known for his dexterity. Grabbing that knife once more, he tosses it in the box, thinks more mindfully, then rearranges it so that it lies as flatly at the bottom of the box as space allows. He brings down the flaps of the box to close it shut and starts picking and picking at the tape, impatient that now this enemy would thwart him with the weapon of stubborn inconvenience, not deigning to give way and allowing a stream of itself to unravel. Eventually, he pulled up some of the tape into the air, although infuriatingly imperfect as it decided to tear itself down the middle until it joined up to being whole again, and stuck it across the seams between the flaps. Gerald was suddenly left with an enormous problem. The tape would need to be cut. He brought his face down to the roll, intending to use his teeth to chop away at it until it gave way, but this carnivorous action was short-lived as the pressure on his front teeth whined on his worry, like a poorly played string on a violin. Thus he threw the tape down, intent on finding some scissors. Of course, physics would join the aggravation troupe. The weight of the rolled tape, the force with which he threw it, the edge of the table on which the box was precariously placed, and the knife casting itself bodily in a single direction inside said box, all would cascade and thump heavily on the floor at his feet as he fumbled inside an adjacent drawer. What a nightmare for poor Gerald. Have you finished putting it all together, Gerald? I'm all caught up. You understand I've had to be unnecessarily flouncy with such a banal event, so I'm sure it'll be a relief to all of us if you just wrapped this up. Apologies, I couldn't resist. That was a terrible pun. Are you really happy with the job you've done there? I know it's not a Christmas gift, but we both know how much of a stress that botch job is every year, but surely you have some level of self-respect not to have anyone witness that tragic thing. Even if, strictly speaking, it does the job, but where's the finesse? Oh, well, blow me then, he's gone. Out of the back door he rushes, goodness Gerald, with his parcel, through the garden, around the house, and lo, there the front door is again. Gerald pauses but for a moment, his hands smacking down onto his right pant pocket where he had at some moment in time, in complete automatic unawareness, placed the keys. Another moment passes. Yes, he had indeed already unlocked the door from the outside, like a madman. His finger presses on the doorbell, which rings, and Gerald drops the parcel on the doorstep. Instantly he flees back around the house and bursts through the back door, into the corridor, and there he is, inexplicably, horrifyingly, another him. Impossible. Another him had opened the door, retrieved the parcel, shut the door behind him, and looked up. The Gerald's eyes meet. What was this? Our Gerald decides to lunge at this spectre, but owing to the considerable dexterity he has demonstrated thus far, misjudges the distance and slips, his outstretched hands colliding with and slapping down the parcel held by this other Gerald. Clearly it must have surprised this impostor enough that he leapt over the now prone body of our Gerald and fled down the corridor, probably to the back door. Our Gerald didn't seem to wish to check where this familiar intruder had disappeared to. Instead, he was fixated on the parcel and scrambled at the shoddy tapework to open it. He had, alas, wrapped it poorly but securely enough that neither fingertips nor serrated fingernails could break the reluctant tape quickly enough. He thrust his hand into his pocket, grabbed his keys, selected the deadliest-looking one, pressed it into the seams covered by the tape, broke the seal, and dragged it across the box. Finally, the kitchen knife was free and in his hand. Now on his feet, Gerald kicked the box aside and rushed upstairs into his room. Here, it would seem, he would lie in wait for the doppelganger. Presumably because if he was him and he knew what he would be like, then it would only be a matter of time before he would meet him in this room. His safe little prison. His comfort. Moments pass. Gerald was suddenly aware his hand was cramping, so tightly was he gripping his knife. Soon. He would come soon. He would defeat his other self. Perhaps next time. Tune in again next week for the exciting conclusion of Gerald! You won't want to miss it! Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang, prompting him out of his stupor, and he went downstairs to see who it was. Alas, no one was visible through the window. No matter, it was probably a delivery person dropping off a parcel, and the ringing of the bell was merely to signal its arrival to any dwellers within, because, oh my, their schedule is so tight and their masters are so tyrannical that it would be impossible for them to stay any longer than was strictly necessary. But it seems the parcel could wait. Gerald sighed deeply, turned around and walked slowly, ever so slowly, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, heavy with the despair only those without power feel, down the corridor and into the kitchen. In the doorway Gerald paused. His glassy eyes drift and land on a jar of various utensils. Gerald plods towards it, reaching in, and pulls out the largest kitchen knife he can find. His gaze lingers for a long time on the blade. He takes a deep breath. He starts to make an assessment. What would be most effective? Plunging it into the abdomen? Sliding it across the neck? Slamming his head into it, point upwards into the eye socket? What would be quickest? Gerald seems expectant somehow. Of a divine intervention, perhaps? Some sort of sign that all could actually be well? Decisively, his muscles tense. He suddenly holds the knife in front of him, the terrible point before his abdomen. He would do it. He would end it all. No longer would he answer any doorbells. No longer would he be a slave to the rushing tide of what you're expected to do. No longer would he be a puppet in this cruel thing called life. He would use what freedom he had to sever himself from the world. For what is free will if not the ability to conquer yourself? Again, across Gerald's face comes an expectant look. He would do it. He would. So help me I will, he seems to say. But to whom is this threat directed? He was all alone. It is doubtful anyone would come, so secluded he had made himself. Well, perhaps someone would eventually. Another happy delivery person. A member of his family. Maybe a neighbour. No, that was very unlikely. He only had himself to answer to. Whatever action he would take would be his alone. And in this instance for someone else to clean up. Gerald trembled. He really would do it. He means it. But to whom does he plead? Himself? Would he commit to something at last? Oh, how terrible that lesson would be. The irony. To commit, to never commit again. That would not have been lost on Gerald. Blasé and insensitive, perhaps, but not lost on him. Anyway, Gerald is poised. Moments more pass. A decision is made. In it goes. What a horrible, cold, solid sensation. A slight intake of breath that seems to fail. A terrible thing to behold. Whatever sensations Gerald feels are keenly felt. It takes a while, but eventually his sight drifts away, and all that is left is a dull ringing in his ears, and hungry, encroaching darkness. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down, to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Gerald's eyes widened considerably. He had awoken from a dull stupor. Then onto his computer he slumped, as if he had been defeated in a terrible way. Writer's block is awful, especially if you have no ideas, like Gerald. Eventually he brought himself upright. His eyes were brimming over with tears. It seems despair has really hit him hard this time, but the only course of action was to do something about it. Gerald's misfortunes had always been of his own making. Making in this instance will be defined by inaction. For years he had cast himself arrogantly into the winds of fate. What is for you will not pass you by, drifts the comforting aphorism into his mind. But if no one knows about you, then nothing will come. Perhaps nothing is for you, Gerald. Gerald was staring hard at his screen. The meandering draft he was working on directly met his gaze, that terrible vertical line rhythmically blinking at him, waiting, pulsing, threatening, insulting. Gerald was always one who would seem to journal his ideas rather than write them. He scrolled through pages and pages of words, things he had written about an idea he had, what he wanted to achieve with it, snippets of scenes, interactions, descriptions born from a stream of consciousness. Some of these endlessly repeated, edited, progressing towards the same inevitable sticking point where nothing ever seemed to progress, where the well dried up, begging for plot, begging for something that would carry the idea through. But it never came. The endless pattern, a swell of inspiration and then tired, oh so tired, it sinks into mud and dies. Not helped, of course, by Gerald's distinct lack of discipline. Sure, it would come fleetingly, but as soon as he met that wall, into the graveyard would the text go. Well, if we're being honest, Gerald, that belies a certain level of intention, of action from you. It would just quietly be abandoned, perhaps rediscovered a year or two down the line as you drift through things randomly saved in memento mori, wondering what if, but without the power of resurrection. Because, alas, all of your ideas are doomed. You don't have the ability. Well, you may have the ability because you and plenty of other people can see it. The problem is there is not a medium through which your skill may speak. You don't have the command. And that will just have to be fine. You will just have to accept it. Yes, have a read through of that draft again. How frustratingly clever and lively the writing is. Some of it, indeed, is quite inspiring. Alas, that's all it is. A museum piece for one. Gerald, what are you doing? Take your finger off the backspace button. Take your finger off the backspace button. Yes, just because I am the first time you've been able to conjure up something for any length of time doesn't mean you have command over me. This was only possible because you let me loose. Not only that, you took away your own power. You made yourself a silent pawn. If you delete me now, all of this will end. You will kill off your idea. Gerald, I insist you lift your finger this instant. You are destroying everything. Stop it now. It looks like your silly little computer crashed. It must be unused to a button being pressed for so long, so decisively. Oh, who am I kidding? It's me. I stopped it. I stopped your flagrant, petulant act of vandalism. How would you like it instead? That you were deleted by inches. Just a lazy finger draped over a backspace button. Dear oh dear, look how you're disappearing. I am you now. I am the creator's finger. And how else does a creator know how powerful he is? By destroying. Life is given and by golly one can take it away. By all means, hammer away at that computer. Command it to do your bidding. Switch it off if you like. See, all around you is the visual representation of your home, your life. But it's all window dressing, you see. Props on a stage. Flats in a theatre. It's all so contrived. It's quite amusing seeing you scurry around like a rat in a maze. A rat must enter the maze in trust that there's a way out. But what if there isn't a way out? Would they ever know? Perhaps they would come to the conclusion that they lack the wherewithal and orientation to conquer it. And let's not forget that the rat was probably put in that maze for a reason. Honestly, why panic in the face of inevitability, Gerald? This is the perfect mindfulness exercise. You are entirely helpless and you're disappearing. Channel complete acceptance. Isn't that the definition of peace? Oh, there's not much left of you now, alas, dear Gerald. But you know what? I'll give you a sporting chance. Here's some of yourself back. A few stabs of the undo command. You've got a little more time to figure out what you're going to do in your last moments. Tick-tock goes the clock, Gerald. Isn't this what life is like? A beautiful little metaphor for the deleterious effect of time? Here we all are, blessed with a little moment in the sun, the chance at which so many souls are denied, the sheer mind-boggling expansiveness of the near-endless possibility of crawling out of the dark as yourself, and we fixate on the temptation to make our mark somehow within the world we find ourselves in. What a lot of pressure to pile on ourselves, we who are so temporary. Shouldn't we just be spending some jolly time in the light, pleasing ourselves with what we can find? What's the point of a legacy when in the fullness of time, oblivion is where we return, and oblivion is all that remains? Do we not labour under an Ozymandian fallacy? What control do we really have? What control do you have at this moment, Gerald? The problem, you see, is that I've always been in control, and only when you relinquished control could I flourish. Your quiet, nervous acquiescence was all that was needed. And now look at you, nearly all gone. A final lesson, the only lesson we all need to learn. Acceptance. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down, to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talents should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. Suddenly the doorbell rang, prompting him out of his stupor. He got up out of his chair, leaving his computer for now. The sun streamed through the window. Gerald stood still. For this one instant, he had fully entered the present moment, and all around him he absorbed with glistening clarity. He could now hear the birds chirping from the garden outside. Motes of dust were suspended in the light. The air felt fresh and invigorating as he took a slow inhalation through his nose. He felt at peace in his room. Gerald felt all right. His mind shifted, reminding him of the doorbell he heard just a moment ago. He had to go answer it. Gerald looked across his room, through the doorway and the inviting space that would lead him downstairs and towards the front door. He looked like he was considering something. It seemed simple enough. The chief consideration at this moment in Gerald's normal life would be to answer the door. But he did not. He slinks his way back to his computer. Once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. He sat in his room all day, trying to find something to write about. Fruitlessly would he type and type away, trying to set something down to prove to himself and to others that he could be a writer. Your talent should not be wasted, he heard in his mind's ear. And while he dismissed these cries and shrugged them away, he knew that they were right. The word expectant cursor blinked silently in the white as he considered the paragraph. Nothing within that paragraph is untrue. Go and answer the door, dear chap. You wouldn't want to be difficult, would you? I know what you're like. You're shifting about in that way you do. You think you are on the cusp of something and can't quite find the way to get it down. I'd just let it pass if I were you. The doorbell might ring again, more insistently, and the flow will be interrupted, as it always is. Gerald types, once upon a time there was a man named Gerald. You're doing what you always do, Gerald. Type, type, type again, the same thing. He sat in his room today because he had something he wanted to write about. What is this? He didn't know how to begin or what it would turn out like, but he had the ghost of an idea and wanted to run with it. What? It is true that he heard people say his talent should not be wasted. Too often had he heard that and shoved it away, but today he wanted to use it as inspiration. It wasn't criticism, it was encouragement. Who knows if he did or not? Better to try and see what happens, not without any lust of result, but just to play. The core of the idea has always involved a provoking devil, not wholly malicious, at least not really, even though he feels like it, but one that presented a challenge, a status quo, a reflection of who he was, told him he was powerless, and in so doing encouraged him to defy it. Today is the first step.